The following podcast is a production of Cityview Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
The following program is not ashamed of the gospel and is about to tell you the truth.
Continually, we are reminded here and in our lives what a remarkable book the Bible is. And by remarkable, I mean miraculous. And along with being a remarkable book, it is so amazingly resilient. It has survived its critics, and it seems as though its most outspoken opponents come and go, but it just lives on. And yet, in spite of its remarkable, miraculous, and resilient characteristic, it is really amazing to see how few Christians, in the right sense of the word, are proud of their grip on the Scriptures. More often than not, it is a cause of embarrassment to admit how virtually ignorant we are of this Bible for which we say we would die. Reminds me of a friend of mine who gave a series of entrance exams in a Christian college, and on the exam, which was really a basic questionnaire of Bible facts, was the question, what are the epistles? And one well-meaning young man wrote, the epistles are the wives of the apostles. Well, it was just absolutely hilarious, and so I shared that a number of years ago here at our church. And I noticed one of our men did not laugh at the time, and when it was over, he came up to me and he says, if they weren't the wives of the apostles, whose wives were they?
Life matters, and the issues in life matter because they affect how we live our lives. In this podcast, Pastor Walt McFadden thinks out loud about truth and discerns how it is being applied to everyday life. Thinking Out Loud podcast is a production of Cityview Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Pastor Walt, thinking out loud again, and I love when you think out loud because you always come up with some good ideas. Now, Sunday, you came up with a very interesting idea. Before you actually started your sermon, you prayed the Lord's Prayer, but you did so in a practical kind of teaching way. Number one, why did you do that? And tell us, what were you hoping to accomplish as you did it that way?
People have been asking me about my prayer life, and I've shared this story quite a few times that through a trying time in my life a few years ago, the Lord really awakened my prayer life and lengthened it. And I keep being asked by people, how do you pray for so long? And so I thought, well, I'll tell them one of the practices I use is to pray through the Lord's Prayer, but not just the Lord's Prayer as Jesus gave to us, but I think that's a guideline. And I expanded on that and taught, well, what would I pray around a phrase like Our Father? What does that really mean for the Christian? Why did Jesus begin his prayer with that? So on.
Okay, and it was very effective, I thought. I mean, everyone knew you were praying through, but your paragraphs of prayer between the little bullet points of the Lord's Prayer was very well done. And hopefully it gave people an idea of how to lengthen and integrate that into their prayer life. So you're going to start a new series. In fact, you did on Sunday. It's the Gospel of Luke. And why did you choose Luke instead of John or Mark or one of the other Gospels, Matthew?
Because of the theme of discipleship. I see Jesus' plan very clearly outlined in the book of Luke. He starts with a few disciples gathering around, then he calls some specific disciples to follow him, and then eventually he calls out of this big group of disciples, apostles. We always put the apostles and the disciples together in the church. We don't understand there's a big difference between the two. It's one thing to follow Jesus, it's another thing to be sent out by Jesus. And so ultimately, everybody should have some kind of a missional or apostolic ministry, but these 12, and of course, the number 12 is a number of completion, and it's an important number in the nation of Israel's history. You had 12 tribes of Israel, for example, and you had 12 sons of Jacob. So Jesus is sticking with that theme of 12, and he calls 12 out of his disciples. So it says, he called his disciples together, and out of his disciples he chose 12. And later on, we're going to go through some other groups, large groups of disciples, and he's going to continue to call apostles or sent ones out of there. And the largest group was 72. But I'm sure that was a pattern that continued through the early church, because we see this exponential growth until we get to the end of the first 300 years of Christianity, and they estimate about half of the Roman Empire by that time is Christian.
Sunday was very good sermon, by the way. Now, you weren't necessarily teaching principles or values. You were actually giving information, like a introduction, and I liked it a lot. So you said well, I guess I put my words in your mouth, but it's kind of like a 30-foot view is what you were doing Sunday, and then during the rest of the year, you will narrow it down to verses and chapters. So give us that 30-foot view of the Gospel of Luke. What's unique about it that you had mentioned on Sunday?
Well, first, it's written to the Gentiles. Most believe that Luke himself was a Gentile, but that's not for certain. One of the early church fathers mentions that he was a Gentile. He could possibly have been Jewish, or maybe he came like Timothy from part pagan, part Jewish home. We don't really know. But he definitely appeals to the Gentile audience. He also has a lot of historical information, times, and not specific dates, but periods of time where he talks about somebody being a governor, or somebody being a king, or somebody being a ruler over a particular region. We had Herod the Great at the beginning of Jesus' life, and then, of course, his sons begin to parcel out his kingdom, which is kind of strange because the Romans didn't normally allow that. They must have thought highly of Herod the Great. Not to get too far off the track, but he won the confidence of the Roman Emperor Augustine. So there's just fascinating things like that. But I like the methodical approach that Luke takes through the process of beginning with the birth of the ministry of Jesus and its growth through the lives of these young men to the point where when Jesus leaves, they're ready to take the church and expand and go into the rest of the Roman Empire.
Now, it has been reported that Luke was a physician, which might have meant that he had a little bit more precision on how he saw things. He certainly wasn't Mark. Mark just kind of ran. He was like a summary, But Luke had a little more detail. However, I'm wondering why Luke wrote a gospel, because he really didn't walk with Jesus. So where did he get his information, for example?
Several sources. One of them probably was John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. They were most likely in the city of Rome at the same time, because Peter leaves Jerusalem and goes to Rome. We don't know when that happened, but we know that he was there and that he was crucified under the reign of Nero. Same with Paul. Paul was beheaded under the reign of Nero. So you're starting to see the martyrdom of many of the important figures, the early apostles in the church. One of the theories that was raised to me, which would make a lot of sense, we can't prove it in any way, but it kind of gives us an idea that there might have been some other purpose for Luke other than to just produce another gospel. And the theory was that maybe Luke prepared this for the lawyer who was defending Paul before Nero, to give him a background of the Christian faith. You see, when Paul goes before Felix and Festus, he gives the background information of his life and of his ministry and how he came to faith in Christ. So that must have been important to give them context of understanding. So something like that could have been at the root cause. The other reason just might have been that Luke, being a Gentile, had a passion to write a gospel specifically for the Gentile believers. Mark is written to this Roman mindset, and Matthew is written to the Jews. So maybe Luke foresaw, there's a need here. But we have to remember, at the beginning of Luke, he records many have undertaken to record an account of the life of Jesus. So there were certainly a lot of written records of the life of Jesus. Those have all disappeared, except one source where 99% sure that Paul consulted, and that was the Gospel of Mark.
Well, I know that Luke also wrote Acts, and those were, if I understand it correctly, that was one book at one time. At least it's reported to be one book, and they broke it up. So he really wrote a lot, right? I mean, you said on Sunday he was the most prolific New Testament writer. Is that correct?
He had the longest gospel.
Longest gospel,
So,
okay. But
yes.
then when you put Luke and Acts together, that's a lot of chapters.
Yeah, and I guess I haven't thought about it being the most prolific writer, but in terms of volume, we know
right.
that, of course, Paul did, but I have a love for this, and I know you do. I have a love for history. I want to know what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably Luke's personality. He liked to keep records. He liked to send information to people and encourage them in their faith. That's the purpose. The real purpose was given to us by Luke. He says, so that you may be certain of what you believe. So Theophilus was probably not a person who knew Jesus. He wasn't there from the beginning, but Luke has the heart to strengthen his faith and tell him from the eyewitness accounts what actually happened in the early times of Christianity.
So you have, there's, I don't know how many chapters, 24 chapters, so you got a big task ahead of you. In fact, you said it'll probably take over a year to get through it. Do you have a theme for all of this? Do you have a specific theme you're calling the preaching through the Gospel of Luke?
I do, and the theme that I've chosen is the theme of discipleship. I want to show people how to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. I think this is the direction the church has taken around the world, and the direction that they don't have the luxury in countries where Christianity is persecuted of putting up a building and drawing people to the building. They have to be in homes, they have to be in secret, and so it really depends a lot more on the individual disciple. And when you start to disciple people, you grow up pretty fast, or you drop out of it and say it's not for me. But it forces us, because disciples have questions, and disciplers need to answer the questions. And you're nothing more than a hypocrite if you sit before people and tell them to follow Jesus and you're not following Jesus. And this is a basic thing we missed in the church. We haven't just called people to follow Jesus. We say, come to our ministry, your kids are going to have a blast. Come to our ministry because we're going to just get you in and out quick on Sunday morning. I knew that our service was going long on Sunday morning. I didn't know it was going 2 hours and 15 minutes. But
Yeah.
One person said, wow, the time flew, because there was a lot going on in the church service. We had a great testimony time, great worship time, and I think the preaching wasn't half bad myself.
Yeah, you'll say that yourself, right? I got it. Well, let me ask you this then. I think that you mentioned Theophilus, and you had mentioned that he was and could have been the lawyer. There's no evidence necessarily that that's true, but speculation, right? And that would make sense. Theophilus could have been some sort of magistrate or somebody that Luke wanted to really influence, or at least give, as you said earlier, a record, a document of how the gospel began. So in your goals for 2022 and probably part of 2023 is to teach out of the book of Luke. And yet you say it's discipleship. So but really, what do you want out of it? I mean, do you have certain specific goals you want your congregation to know after a year of preaching? What do you want them to walk away with?
I want them to put their eyes on Jesus, first off. I want them to follow him, and I want them to get excited about discipleship. I want them to get excited about sharing their faith. And I don't just mean our typical perspective and view of evangelism, but I want them to share with the next generation what they know about Jesus and begin to grow in their faith and the excitement of following Jesus. Church can get, no matter how exciting a church is, a church can get dry, you can get dull, you can lose interest. You got this person talking at me every week, but if you turn your learning into teaching others, and you turn the church into a laboratory of experimentation, like I did with the Lord's Prayer, and I can't do that all the time with everything, but I know this other pastor pretty well, and he always talks to me about clarity. Any idea who I might be talking about?
No, he's probably some sort of radical or...
Yeah, you always talk to me about clarity, and I've been thinking about that. And one of the things I've been thinking about, this is just an example, we talk about baptism and the Lord's Supper all the time, and most people have very little knowledge of what that really means. So I've been reading a lot about baptism and the Lord's Supper. I really want to explain to people what it means. There's a lot of meaning to baptism. There's a lot of meaning to the Lord's Supper. Baptism is the starting point of following Christ. So what does that mean? If I was baptized, I'm saying something to the world. What am I trying to communicate to those around me who don't know Christ by being baptized? For most people in America, being baptized, it happens as an infant, and that's somehow your get out of hell free card. But baptism is something that's supposed to be done by believers, typically by immersion, and it's a public statement to unbelievers to say, I am now following Jesus Christ. My old person is dead, and now I'm alive. And communion, so many things about it. It's about our love for one another, unity in the church, also our identification with Christ. And those 2 points are the starting point of our walk with Christ. And what we want to say at the beginning of our walk with Christ is, I am identifying with him. I am also dying. I'm also taking up my cross. I'm also following him. So I want to bring clarity to what is discipleship. We know, I've talked about it many times in the church, the congregation has a fairly good idea of what it means, what a disciple means. It's a philosophy or a method of teaching that's been around for hundreds of years, and it's the method that Jesus used. It's sort of like apprenticeship. You walk with a person and they give you opportunity to do the things that they did, and then eventually you start walking on your own and you start discipling other people. I want to see that it's been happening in the church, and I'm a visionary. I can just envision it. I can envision new people coming to the church and being baptized into the Christian faith as followers and disciples of Jesus Christ, with the idea that eventually they'll turn around and they'll lead others. And we see this in a lot of the young people in our church are now discipling other young people. I was told by our youth pastor, Kenneth, that our youth group is growing. The kids are becoming much more interested. And I think the big reason is because the youth leaders are just a little bit older than them, and they have a passion to invest in the lives of those young people, and they spend time with them outside of youth group and outside of the church.
Well, Pastor, I want to encourage you to continue to do that. Sometimes we think, oh my gosh, people are going to get so sick of me talking about discipleship. But, we need to be reminded all the time. My daughter-in-law is a physician, and she goes to seminars all the time, Pastor Walt. It's not that she doesn't know medicine. It's the fact that she needs to learn how to maybe do things differently, or a different perspective, or to be encouraged to continue to do medicine in a practical and responsible way. So same thing with discipleship. I mean, we may know what a disciple is, but we need to be reminded of it, and there may be some things in our discipleship that we need to make some changes. I mean, that's
a good illustration. Yeah. Can I use that illustration from your daughter-in-law? Can I
Absolutely.
steal that?
Oh, you can steal anything. Hey, Pastor Walt, there's nothing I have that's mine. I mean, that's just the way it is. So you've been studying this gospel for some time. I know you said that on Sunday, 6 months or so you've been preparing. So tell me one big surprise that you've come to so far that you found in the gospel.
Here's the biggest surprise, the rejoicing, the joy. You see it all the way through. These are the little things that are so easy. I talked about how the Gospel of Mark uses the word immediately all the time, or right away, depending on the translation, because that's what the Romans did. They were acted immediately or right away. And I see in the book of Luke the rejoicing. You have the rejoicing of those who witnessed the birth of Jesus. You have those rejoicing who are with Jesus in the temple when he's circumcised on the 8th day. You have Mary singing a song of worship, and it begins and it ends with rejoicing. The rejoicing of the coming birth. There's Zechariah and Elizabeth, they're the parents of John the Baptist. She's older. She hasn't had any children. And God miraculously allows her to bear a son, John the Baptist. So there's rejoicing at that. And then in the end, the disciples witness Jesus going to heaven, and they go away rejoicing at that point. And then it picks up on that, of course, in the book of Acts, the rejoicing and the spreading of the gospel. So that's the part I'm pleasantly surprised in that, and that's what the gospel is. The gospel is good news. So Luke is drawing out the good news, and he's saying, look at all these people's lives, what happened to them. Zacchaeus rejoices when he pays back what he owes. The man who looks for the lost coin, he rejoices over it. Jesus says there's more rejoicing in heaven over one who comes back than the 99 that are already into the fold. So there's constant rejoicing in the book of Luke.
Well, I think that's a good way of looking at it. I want to conclude on another question because I think it's important. I want to remind the audience as well that if they missed last week's sermon, which had the introduction to the Gospel of Luke, they can catch it on Facebook. All you have to do is search for Cityview and it'll come up. But moving forward now, we want to invite people to come and be a part of the verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter, starting, I believe, this Sunday. But Pastor Walt, you said you would be 1 year or more preaching through Luke. So that's an expository preacher. That's what you do, verse-by-verse, chapter-by-chapter. It's a good way of teaching the Bible. But is there ever a time where you need to address the church, say for something that happens in our city, and you need to preach on that? Would you do that, or would you wrap that into the verse by verse? What do you do with those kinds of incidences that they need to hear from their pastor on things that happen in the city?
Yeah, for sure. I do that quite often. I mean, we went through a very troubling time recently, of course, with the pandemic and the riots here in Minneapolis. And so I stepped out of my series. I don't remember what series I was in at the time. I stepped out to address this is what our church is going to do during the pandemic, and this is how we're going to approach this so I could keep the church unified. And then the response to the George Floyd incident and how we're going to respond to that. But there are other things that happen around the world that we need to just stop what we're doing and get some clear instruction. There are also times when I'll step out of a series and say, hey, I need to talk about marriage. I need to talk about parenting, something like that. So yeah, absolutely, I'm not tied to it. And those are the things that make a series like this go longer than a year.
Yeah.
But at least I'm not going to spend 25 years like Spurgeon did in the book of Romans. I don't know how anybody could preach a book that long, but he did it.
Well, yeah, I hear you. Well, as people are listening, what can they do to prepare for Luke? I mean, do you have them read ahead? Do you have them read a chapter by chapter? I mean, is there ways that people can kind of be better prepared? Because they know where you're going, right? I mean, your sermons are going to come out of the Gospel of Luke. Is there anything you can tell your audience about what to do or how to prepare for your sermons from week to week?
First, read the book of Luke all the way through, and then spend some time skimming the book. So once you've read it, skim the book. And I mean, just go through and look at highlights. You can cheat a little bit and look at those chapter headings or those paragraph section headings and look at those and see if you see common themes through there. Because like I just talked about a minute ago, it's easy to miss a theme like rejoicing when you've got your eyes on every word and you're not kind of looking at that from that 30-foot high perspective. And then the third thing I would say is read a chapter every day, the same chapter. So if we're going to be in the chapter 1 for the next few weeks, read chapter 1 every day for a week. And you'll be surprised at how much more you get out. So those three things: read the book all the way through, skim the book, and read whatever chapter we're in over and over again, how many times you can.
Well, Pastor Walt, thanks again for thinking out loud. It's very helpful and very insightful. So we'll be enjoying your journey through the Gospel of Luke in 2022. Thanks again for joining us.
You're listening to Thinking Out Loud with Walt McFadden.
In the case of the Thessalonians, their lack of knowledge led to unnecessary grieving, and because of that, a poor testimony among the pagans. But in other places in Scripture, a lack of knowledge can lead to something far more detrimental. Let me give you a few verses. Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. Yes, my people. My people. You see, just because you're His people doesn't necessarily mean that you're just living in a secure place. In one sense it does. But I want you to know something. Your lack of knowledge can get you into a whole bunch of danger. Why do we constantly teach our children? If we don't teach our children, they're still our children, but we teach our children why? So they don't kill themselves. So they don't mess up their lives. My people are destroyed, He says, for a lack of knowledge. And then in Isaiah 5:13, He says, my people go into exile for their lack of knowledge. Now you say, oh, well, exile for their lack of knowledge. Do you know what exile was? Slavery. The cruelest forms. Murder, rape, pillage. A suffering like nothing you and I could ever even understand. It was having a hook poked through your lip or your nose and being led off to a foreign land naked.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast today, and please let us know your thoughts on our topic. We want to hear your feedback and your concerns as you think out loud. Please visit us at cvcmpls.org. That's cvcmpls.org.